we have breaking news regarding the terrifying abduction of Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of television anchor Savannah Guthrie. She was taken from her Tucson home at 2 in the morning on February 1st. For weeks, the public assumed this was a burglary gone wrong. But today, top criminal profilers from the Federal Bureau of Investigation have officially rejected that initial theory. They stated this was a meticulously calculated crime. The ruthless perpetrator did not break in to target property. He targeted Nancy specifically. This chilling declaration completely shatters previous assumptions and brings us to one central question. Why would someone intentionally hunt down an 84-year-old woman who lives alone and relies on a pacemaker just to stay alive? Exactly how cruel and terrifying is the true motive driving this heartbreaking case forward? Today, we uncover the incredibly dark answers that experts have just revealed to the entire watching world. Let us begin by thoroughly examining the first major revelation that has completely shifted the trajectory of this investigation. For several consecutive weeks, the prevailing narrative surrounding the heartbreaking disappearance of 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie rested on a seemingly logical but ultimately flawed assumption. The general public, alongside numerous early media commentators, widely speculated that a random, disorganized burglar broke into the quiet Tucson residence, panicked upon unexpectedly encountering the elderly homeowner, and somehow drastically escalated the situation into a full-scale abduction. However, top-tier former Federal Bureau of Investigation agents Jim Fitzgerald and Greg Rogers have now stepped forward to entirely dismantle and reject this initial theory. Through their rigorous behavioral analysis, they have presented a compelling argument that clearly outlines the fundamental psychological and tactical differences between a standard crime of opportunity and a crime of calculated, malicious intent. According to the detailed breakdown provided by Rogers, a standard robbery is almost entirely dependent on immediate access and finding the path of least possible resistance. A common, financially motivated thief actively looks for an incredibly easy target, such as an unlocked back window, an open garage door, or a residence that is visibly dark and completely empty. Their primary objective is to get inside the structure quietly, grab whatever valuable electronic devices or jewelry are within easy arm's reach, and escape the premises without ever making physical contact with or even seeing another human being. A targeted kidnapping, on the other hand, operates on a completely different, vastly more dangerous psychological wavelength. It requires extensive forethought, careful physical surveillance of the target, and a chilling level of premeditation. The perpetrator in this specific case did not simply stumble upon this particular house by sheer accident while wandering the neighborhood. They chose this specific address with absolute, deadly precision. This analytical framework brings the investigation to the single most critical detail of the established timeline, the exact hour the intrusion occurred. The breach of the residential property took place at approximately 2 in the morning. To an experienced criminal profiler, this specific timestamp is not merely a minor, passing detail. It serves as a glaring spotlight directly illuminating the attacker's true, underlying motive. If an individual is solely interested in stealing physical property, the absolute worst possible time to forcefully break into a residential home is in the dead middle of the night. At 2 in the morning, the entire neighborhood is completely blanketed in darkness, but far more importantly, the residents of those homes are almost guaranteed to be inside, heavily asleep in their beds. Experienced property thieves actively and desperately avoid human confrontation. They heavily prefer to strike in the middle of the afternoon on a weekday, specifically when homeowners are away at their offices working or out running daily errands. By deliberately choosing to breach the residence at 2 in the morning, specifically when the surrounding suburban streets were dead quiet and all neighboring porch lights were extinguished, the intruder made a highly calculated, tactical choice. They knew with absolute certainty that the elderly homeowner would be present and asleep. This specific timing proves, beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt, that the ultimate objective of this home invasion was never to sweep the living room for inanimate objects. The primary goal, from the very beginning of this nightmare, was to physically ambush, completely control, and extract a living human being. They struck at 2 a.m. because they wanted to ensure she was disoriented, physically isolated, and entirely unable to call out for help or trigger a rapid response from local law enforcement agencies. Furthermore, former agent Jim Fitzgerald highlights a deeply disturbing element of the aftermath that solidly reinforces this terrifying profiling assessment: the absolute silence regarding the massive financial reward. Very shortly after the violent abduction took place, the family and local authorities desperately put forward a staggering $1 million reward for any credible information leading to her safe and immediate return. If this were a simple, disorganized home invasion committed by a desperate, low-level criminal looking for a quick financial score, a massive sum of $1 million would almost certainly force some kind of reaction. A purely financially motivated criminal might attempt to anonymously negotiate, use a dark web intermediary to claim the funds, or abandon the victim in a safe, public location in hopes of securing a life-changing payday without directly facing a capital murder charge. Yet, the enormous reward offer was met with nothing but absolute, chilling silence. Fitzgerald points out that this profound lack of engagement from the suspect is incredibly revealing to investigators. The perpetrator completely ignored an absolute fortune. This deafening silence strongly indicates to the Federal Bureau of Investigation that financial gain is absolutely not the primary driving force behind this ongoing nightmare. The ruthless kidnapper simply does not want the money. He genuinely wants to maintain total, absolute physical control over Nancy Guthrie. The twisted act of holding her captive, the psychological dominance exerted over her high-profile television-anchored daughter, and the dark power derived from flawlessly executing such an audacious, high-stakes crime seemingly hold vastly more psychological value to this dangerous individual than a massive $1 million payout. With the random burglary theory completely thrown out by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, we must confront the chilling reality of what actually happened that night. If the masked intruder who broke into that quiet Tucson home was not looking for a quick payday or expensive jewelry, then law enforcement is left with a deeply disturbing truth. That person walked into that specific house with the sole intention of stealing a human being. This dark realization forces investigators to pivot down the first major pathway of this investigation, bringing us to the terrifying concept of a targeted proxy attack. Former Central Intelligence Agency officer and Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Tracy Walder recently weighed in on this exact nightmare. Her assessment of the situation is incredibly straightforward and heartbreaking for the family. According to her professional experience, the extreme level of deliberate targeting, the specific choice of location, and the absolute clinical precision of this late-night kidnapping completely rule out a common street criminal. An ordinary thief looking for an easy score simply lacks the patience, the discipline, and the sophisticated foresight needed to pull off an abduction of this magnitude. They do not navigate a home in the dark without triggering immediate alarms or leaving behind a massive trail of chaotic physical evidence. Walder firmly believes that this level of almost military-like precision points to a very specific type of attacker. We are looking at someone who is entirely consumed by a dark and unwavering obsession. This attacker did not just pick an 84-year-old woman out of a phone book at random. Instead, they spent weeks meticulously researching her daily routines before pulling off a practically flawless home invasion. This perspective completely changes the direction of the manhunt. It shifts the intense spotlight away from the elderly victim and shines it directly onto her highly visible family connections. It strongly suggests that the true target of this immense rage might not actually be the great-grandmother who was pulled from her bed, but rather her incredibly famous daughter, the prominent television anchor Savannah Guthrie. As a widely recognized national media personality who broadcasts the morning news to millions of American living rooms every single day, she naturally attracts a massive viewing audience from coast to coast. But with that extraordinary level of daily public exposure comes a very real and dangerous dark side. Being on national television every morning inevitably draws the unwanted attention of people who are living entirely out of touch with reality. Profilers like Walder suggest that the kidnapper could easily be a deeply radicalized viewer who is holding on to an intense grudge against the anchor. This anger could have been sparked by a perceived personal insult, a controversial news segment they did not agree with, or a completely fabricated interaction that only exists inside their own troubled mind. Alternatively, this suspect could be a dangerously obsessed stalker who developed a one-sided relationship with the television star, a relationship that has now mutated into a violent and uncontrollable compulsion. In either of these terrifying scenarios, the fundamental driving force behind the crime remains exactly the same. It reveals an overwhelming desire to manipulate, punish, or completely devastate the celebrity. This means the kidnapper does not view the elderly mother as a living, breathing human being. To them, she is just a strategic pawn. She is a highly valuable token meant to be used in a much larger, incredibly twisted psychological game being played entirely against her famous daughter. To really understand this dark motivation, you have to look at the stark logistical realities of being a high-profile media personality in America today. Savannah Guthrie lives inside a highly fortified and constantly monitored security bubble. As a top-tier national news anchor, she is routinely surrounded by trained professional security details wherever she goes. Her primary homes are undoubtedly equipped with the absolute best security cameras and alarm networks money can buy. Furthermore, her daily movements are carefully planned to minimize any potential threats. An obsessed stalker who wants to attack her directly would face impossible hurdles. They would almost certainly be tackled and arrested by armed guards long before they ever got close to her, recognizing that it was completely impossible to break through that wall of security. The ruthless attacker made a staggeringly cruel calculation. They decided that if they could not physically reach their primary target to cause direct harm, they would bypass those massive security measures entirely. They would purposefully strike the absolute softest and most vulnerable point in her personal life. They chose to inflict the maximum amount of psychological devastation possible by capturing her elderly mother right out of her bed. While the theory of a targeted proxy attack against a famous television anchor remains incredibly strong, another leading Federal Bureau of Investigation profiler has introduced a second, equally terrifying possibility. Former behavioral analyst Jim Clement believes that investigators must look at this case from a completely different angle. He suggests that the driving motivation behind this chilling home invasion might have absolutely nothing to do with Savannah Guthrie or her national television platform. Instead, Clement argues that the dark motive stems entirely from the extreme physical vulnerability of the victim herself. In the deeply disturbing mind of a seasoned predator, the decision to strike is often heavily based on a calculated risk assessment. These dangerous individuals actively hunt for the path of least possible resistance. They do not want a difficult fight, they do not want to be challenged, and they certainly do not want to risk drawing the immediate attention of capable neighbors or local law enforcement. When a predator looks at the specific circumstances surrounding this late-night abduction, they do not necessarily see the mother of a prominent celebrity. They see what they would consider the absolute perfect, easiest possible prey. To truly understand this terrifying perspective, we have to look closely at the heartbreaking profile of the victim and her daily living situation. Nancy Guthrie is a woman who is 84 years old, struggles with significant mobility issues, and relies heavily on a pacemaker just to keep her heart beating properly every single day. Furthermore, she lived entirely alone in a standard house located on a very quiet, softly lit residential street in Tucson. She did not own a large guard dog to bark at intruders, and there were no immediately visible, high-tech security alarm systems guarding the perimeter of her property. To a normal, empathetic human being, this describes a sweet elderly woman enjoying her golden years in peaceful solitude. But to a calculating, malicious attacker hiding in the shadows, that exact same profile represents an open window of opportunity. It represents a target who physically cannot run away, who does not have the strength to violently fight back against a home invader, and who does not have a spouse or partner sleeping in the next room who could wake up and immediately dial 911. The profound isolation and the severe physical limitations of a grandmother who is 84 years old make her an incredibly soft target for someone looking to commit a horrible crime without facing any immediate physical pushback. This brings investigators to a chilling, central question. How exactly did the masked suspect know all of these highly specific, deeply personal details about her life? How did they know she lived completely alone, had physical limitations, and lacked a robust security system? Clement points out that criminals do not simply guess this kind of critical information. They have to gather it, which means the perpetrator had to spend a significant amount of time actively casing the neighborhood and closely watching the house. But Clementi takes this terrifying theory one step further, suggesting a deeply unsettling hypothesis about how the attacker gained such intimate knowledge. He proposes that the kidnapper might actually be a routine service professional. Think about the countless strangers we casually allow onto our properties and into our private homes every single year. The suspect could easily be a local plumber who came to fix a leaking sink, a landscaper who regularly mowed the front lawn, an electrician, a pool cleaner, or even a frequent package delivery driver. These everyday local service workers are granted completely legitimate, safe, legal access to walk right up to our front doors and observe our most private living spaces. A predator working in one of these standard jobs would have had the perfect, unquestioned opportunity to casually look around, mentally map the layout of the house, and accurately assess the extreme vulnerability of the elderly homeowner living inside. They could easily notice the lack of a dog bowl on the porch, the absence of security cameras, and the physical frailty of the woman signing for a package. If that specific individual already harbored dark, predatory fixations, that brief, routine service call would have provided them with all the intelligence they needed to build a terrifying plan. They saw a very quiet street, an isolated elderly woman, and a complete lack of home defenses, and they simply decided to use that horrifying advantage to strike. When the neighborhood went completely dark. As investigators continue to dig deeper into the physical evidence left behind at the crime scene, another crucial layer of this deeply disturbing investigation focuses entirely on the psychological state of the masked intruder. To truly understand the terrifying nature of this late-night home invasion, we have to look closely at the behavioral evidence captured on the residential doorbell camera. Former Federal Bureau of Investigation Behavioral Analysis Unit Director Mary Ellen O'Toole recently provided a masterful, chilling breakdown of the security footage. When an expert profiler of her immense caliber watches a piece of video evidence, they do not just look at the clothing or the physical movements of the suspect. They look for the hidden psychological markers that reveal exactly how the criminal is feeling in that specific moment. What O'Toole discovered while analyzing those crucial seconds on the front porch has sent absolute shockwaves through the law enforcement community. The most alarming detail was not a sudden, violent movement or a specific tool the suspect carried. It was something entirely invisible to the untrained eye. According to her expert behavioral assessment, the suspect displayed a horrifying lack of normal human emotion. There was absolutely no visible stress, no frantic rushing, and zero nervousness in his physical posture as he stood on that brightly lit porch. If a normal, rational person suddenly decided to break into a quiet suburban home in the middle of the night to kidnap an 84-year-old grandmother, they would be a complete nervous wreck. Their hands would shake, their breathing would be incredibly shallow, and they would constantly look over their shoulder in sheer panic. But this specific attacker showed none of those standard physiological reactions. He stood on the porch with a deeply unsettling sense of calm, moving with a deliberate, smooth rhythm that completely betrays the extreme violence of his actions. O'Toole concludes that this chilling lack of anxiety means one of two terrifying things. Either this ruthless individual is a highly seasoned serial offender who has committed similar violent crimes many times before, or he has meticulously rehearsed this specific abduction in his own mind for months. He played this twisted fantasy out in his dark imagination so many consecutive times that the physical reality of standing on her front porch felt completely normal to him. The fantasy had already been fully lived. This was simply the final physical execution. This terrifying psychological profile leads us directly into the second, most dangerous aspect of the attacker's mindset. It completely separates him from a standard, financially motivated kidnapper. O'Toole explicitly points out a deeply disturbing similarity between this unknown suspect and one of the most infamous, taunting serial killers in American history. She compared his desperate craving for public attention directly to the legendary Zodiac killer. The Zodiac famously terrorized the nation not just through his horrific crimes, but through his relentless, arrogant communication with local newspapers and law enforcement agencies. He desperately craved the massive media circus that his violence generated. He wanted everyone to know his name, and he wanted to watch entire cities paralyze in fear. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the individual who took Nancy Guthrie from her bed operates on a very similar, highly narcissistic psychological wavelength. This was never meant to be a quiet, secret extortion scheme handled behind closed doors. This undeniable thirst for a massive audience is exactly why the kidnapper deliberately chose to send his initial ransom demands directly to prominent news stations and the popular outlet TMZ. A traditional kidnapper who only wants a quick, multi-million-dollar payout would quietly contact the wealthy family through encrypted channels to negotiate terms privately. They want the money, not the blinding spotlight of national television. But this attacker actively invited the media frenzy. He purposefully leaked his demands because he desperately wants the entire world to watch what he has done. He wants to feel incredibly powerful. He wants to feel culturally significant in a way his normal, pathetic life has never allowed him to feel. More than anything else, this twisted individual wants to see Savannah Guthrie sitting under the bright studio lights of national television, desperately begging for her mother's life. He wants to completely humiliate a very powerful celebrity and force law enforcement to dance to his specific tune on a global stage. This criminal is certainly sitting in front of a television right now, obsessively watching every single news report, feeding his ego, and waiting. Despite the terrifying level of psychological preparation and the seemingly flawless execution of this late-night abduction, no criminal is entirely perfect. When an offender steps out of their dark fantasy and physically enters a real crime scene, they inevitably make critical mistakes. And those microscopic errors are exactly what the Federal Bureau of Investigation is hunting for right now. According to former profiler Jim Clemente, the suspect made one massive, glaring forensic blunder that could ultimately break this entire investigation wide open. While the ruthless intruder was incredibly careful to cover his physical tracks by wearing thick gloves, dark clothing, and a heavy winter ski mask, he made a catastrophic miscalculation. The ski mask he chose to wear that night did not completely cover his face. It left his mouth and the lower portion of his face partially exposed to the open air. This specific detail is a monumental breakthrough for forensic investigators. An exposed mouth means the suspect was heavily breathing, projecting microscopic saliva particles, and potentially leaving behind a goldmine of biological material right on the front porch. Furthermore, investigators have successfully recovered a discarded glove located exactly 2 miles away from the primary crime scene. This glove recently tested positive for unknown male biological material. By carefully combining the potential biological evidence left at the house with the genetic material pulled from that discarded glove, law enforcement is now aggressively utilizing a revolutionary investigative technique known as genetic genealogy. This is the exact same advanced scientific method that famously brought down the notorious Golden State Killer. Investigators are actively uploading this unknown male genetic profile into public genealogy databases, frantically searching for distant relatives, and systematically building an expansive family tree that will eventually lead them straight to the front door of the kidnapper. As the highly specialized forensic teams work around the clock to process that crucial biological evidence, digital analysts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation are simultaneously tearing apart the doorbell camera footage frame by frame. They are hunting for a completely different kind of undeniable physical identifier. While the suspect was standing on the brightly lit porch, moving around and adjusting his physical posture in the moments before he breached the front door, his dark clothing briefly shifted out of place. In that fleeting fraction of a second, the high-definition security camera managed to capture something absolutely vital. It revealed a partially exposed tattoo located on the body of the attacker. For experienced criminal profilers and dedicated gang task force officers, a visible tattoo is essentially a permanent, highly detailed roadmap leading directly to a specific suspect. Tattoos act as sprawling visual databases that can reveal an extraordinary amount of personal history and localized geographical connections. The federal authorities are currently utilizing advanced digital enhancement software to analyze absolutely every single pixel of that brief video clip. They are desperately working to clarify the blurry lines and reconstruct the specific design of the ink. They are actively searching for distinct regional shading styles, specific prison markings, or recognizable gang affiliation symbols that could immediately narrow down their massive suspect pool. Even if the ink turns out to be a completely custom design, it still provides a massive investigative advantage. Law enforcement can take that digitally enhanced image and distribute it to hundreds of local tattoo parlors across the entire state. Finally, the third major forensic breadcrumb that could completely unravel this horrific mystery involves the incredibly specific tactical gear the suspect chose to wear. Throughout the duration of the video footage, the kidnapper is clearly seen wearing a 25-liter Ozark Trail outdoor backpack. Initially, investigators quickly noted that this specific brand of rugged outdoor gear is manufactured and sold exclusively through Walmart retail locations. This immediately prompted a massive, frantic search through thousands of corporate retail transaction records. However, seasoned investigators fundamentally understand that a deeply calculating mastermind who meticulously planned this flawless neighborhood infiltration would almost certainly avoid leaving behind an obvious, easily traceable digital footprint like a personal credit card receipt. Therefore, the investigative net has now been drastically expanded to actively monitor the murky, untraceable waters of the secondary digital marketplace. Detectives are aggressively scouring through thousands of recent transaction logs on platforms like eBay and the Facebook Marketplace. They are looking for anyone who recently purchased or sold that exact 25-liter backpack in the weeks leading up to the tragic abduction. The kidnapper likely believed that by purchasing his tactical gear through an anonymous, cash-only transaction on the unregulated second-hand market, he could successfully sever the digital trail. But every single transaction leaves behind a human witness. The police are desperately hoping that the individual who unknowingly sold that specific 25-liter backpack to a masked stranger will suddenly recognize the item on the evening news and immediately contact the authorities before it is too late. As the federal investigation into the terrifying abduction of 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie enters its most critical phase, experts have reached a chilling consensus that bridges the primary theories. Former Federal Bureau of Investigation profiler Greg McCrary, one of the founding architects of modern criminal profiling, has introduced the disturbing concept of convergence. Initially, law enforcement debated whether the ruthless kidnapper was solely motivated by a dark, proxy-based obsession with national television anchor Savannah Guthrie, or if he was simply a local, calculating predator who opportunistically noticed a highly vulnerable grandmother living entirely alone on a quiet residential street. McCrary strongly asserts that the horrifying truth is actually a deadly combination of both. According to this terrifying convergence theory, the masked suspect is an individual who already harbored a deeply toxic, media-driven fixation on the famous Guthrie family. However, instead of simply remaining a distant, harmless television viewer, this dangerously obsessed individual somehow discovered the critical, logistical vulnerability of the family. He realized that while the famous daughter was heavily protected by armed guards in a high-security environment, her elderly mother was living completely independently and entirely unprotected in Tucson. The suspect successfully merged his twisted celebrity obsession with a cold, predatory calculation. He realized he had found the perfect, soft target to strike. This deadly convergence of motive and extreme physical vulnerability is exactly what finally pushed him over the edge, causing him to take his dark, dangerous fantasy and violently turn it into a devastating physical reality in the middle of the night. The most terrifying aspect of this ongoing nightmare is not just what happened inside that house on February 1st, but what the suspect did immediately afterward. Federal profilers are completely certain that this highly organized, meticulous criminal did not just vanish into thin air. Instead, he has almost certainly slipped right back into his normal, everyday life. He is currently hiding in plain sight, masquerading as a regular neighbor, a reliable coworker, or an ordinary family member. This is exactly why the Federal Bureau of Investigation is now making an urgent, desperate plea to the general public. Law enforcement agencies cannot solve this baffling case without immediate community assistance. The authorities are asking everyone to look closely at the men in their own lives. They are specifically hunting for an individual who exhibited a sudden, completely unexplained change in his normal, daily routine right around the time of the kidnapping. Did someone you know suddenly miss work, cancel long-standing personal plans, or completely disappear from their normal social circles for a few days immediately following February 1st? Furthermore, investigators are asking the public to report anyone who has recently displayed an unhealthy, obsessive level of interest in Savannah Guthrie, her broader family, or the intense, ongoing media coverage surrounding this specific criminal investigation. The person who committed this horrific act is carrying a massive secret, and that psychological pressure will inevitably cause leaks. Somebody out there knows this man, and somebody has absolutely noticed these strange, uncharacteristic behavioral shifts over the last few weeks. To encourage that crucial individual to finally step out of the shadows and speak the absolute truth, the authorities have officially escalated the stakes. The total financial reward for any credible, verified information that leads directly to the safe return of Nancy Guthrie and the successful capture of her violent kidnapper has now been officially increased to a staggering $1,200,000. This massive, life-changing sum of money is waiting for the one brave person willing to do the right thing and break their silence. The family is desperately waiting for answers, and time is rapidly running out for an 84-year-old woman who requires daily medical care and a pacemaker just to survive. If you have seen anything suspicious, recognize the backpack, or know a man whose behavior changed after the 1st of February, you must act immediately. Do not hesitate, and do not assume that your small tip is entirely useless. You are strongly urged to immediately contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation by calling their national toll-free hotline at 1-800-CALL-THE-FEDERAL BUREAU. Alternatively, you can directly reach out to the dedicated detectives at the Pima County Sheriff Department. Every single passing second is critical in a kidnapping investigation of this magnitude. The community must come together to bring this grandmother home and ensure this ruthless predator faces ultimate and final justice. Thank you for watching this detailed investigative report today. Your continued support truly helps us uncover the hidden truth behind these terrifying criminal cases. If you found this breakdown valuable, please subscribe to our channel and share this video. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and we will see you next time.